Not all kings are born in castles, some rise from the soil. Valmoria stood at the edge of ruin, a dying king, a kingdom without an heir, and whispers of an ancient prophecy. The prophecy spoke of a ruler, not of noble blood, but of the people, a leader who would rise when Valmoria needed him most. But no one expected the chosen one to be a farmer. He had never worn a crown, never raised a sword, never set foot in a throne room. But when the kingdom's future hung by a thread, when war loomed on the horizon, he did not run. He did what true rulers do: rule. The kingdom of Valmoria was crumbling. Its once proud banners, now tattered and dull, hung limply in the palace courtyard. Years of political discord, dwindling resources, and a failing monarchy had left the kingdom on the brink of collapse. King Aldred, a once mighty ruler, now lay frail and feverish upon his grand chamber bed, his breast shallow and his skin paled. His only daughter, Princess Evelyn, stood at his bedside, gripping his frail hand as she watched the life drain from his body. The reality was grim. Without a male heir, the kingdom's future was uncertain. Rumors of an ancient prophecy had circulated for generations. It spoke of the chosen one, a ruler who would bring prosperity in Valmoria's darkest hour. The Council of Elders had long debated the prophecy's meaning, but with the king's death imminent and no legitimate successor in sight, they had no choice but to seek answers. A gathering was called in the Sacred Hall of Wisdom, a grand chamber lined with towering stone pillars and the flickering glow of torches, casting long shadows upon the council's aged faces. The kingdom's most powerful nobles and scholars had assembled, waiting anxiously as the head elder, Master Callan, stepped forward. The prophecy speaks of a ruler born from the soil, the lifeblood of Valmoria, he announced, his voice resonating through the chamber, one who had never sought the throne, but is fated to wield it. A hush fell over the gathering as whispers spread like wildfire. They had expected a noble name to be called, a warrior, a scholar, perhaps even a forgotten prince from a distant land. But when Callan spoke the chosen name, the air turned thick with disbelief. Henry of Eldemir. Gasps echoed across the chamber. Eldemir was no noble estate, no great house. It was a quiet farming village on the outskirts of the kingdom, known for its rolling wheat fields and little else. And Henry? A mere farm boy. He never set foot in the royal court, never held a sword with intent, and certainly never dreamt of wearing a crown. In that very moment, miles away, Henry was tending to the family's modest plot of land, his hands caked in soil as he harvested the last of the season's crops. He was content with a simple life, oblivious to the chaos unfolding in the capital. That was until the king's royal guards arrived on horseback, their silver armor glinting in the afternoon sun. His mother clutched his arm in fear as the captain dismounted. "Henry of Eldemir," the captain proclaimed, unrolling a sealed scroll. "By decree of the Council of Elders, you are summoned to the royal palace. You are the chosen one." Henry's stomach twisted. He let out a disbelieving chuckle, wiping his hands on his tunic. "You must have the wrong man," he insisted. "I'm just a farmer." "The prophecy has spoken," the captain replied, his tone unwavering. "You are the heir to the throne of Valmoria." Henry could barely process the words before he was ushered onto a horse, leaving behind the only life he had ever known. Back in the palace, Princess Evelyn seethed as she listened to the council's decision. She had spent her entire life preparing to lead, mastering diplomacy, swordsmanship, and the art of governance. And yet, she had been cast aside for some commoner with dirt under his nails. The thought of bowing to a man who had never set foot in the court sickened her. "This is an insult to Valmoria," she spat, glaring at Master Callan. "You expect me to stand aside while some farmhand takes my father's throne?" "The prophecy does not lie," Callan replied. "Henry is the one destined to rule." Evelyn clenched her fists. If the council thought she could quietly accept this absurd decree, they were mistaken. She would prove Henry unworthy, one way or another. She would take back the throne, and so the reluctant heir and the embittered princess would soon cross paths, their fates entwined in a kingdom on the verge of ruin. Henry sat stiffly in the grand council chamber, his back straight yet his hands clenched into nervous fists beneath the heavy wooden table. The golden chandeliers flickered above, casting a warm glow over the assembled nobles, and military commanders. Their expressions were a mixture of skepticism and disdain. He had been king for less than a week, and already Valmoria stood on the edge of war. Tremor's forces are moving along the eastern border, General Alric announced, his grizzled face lined with years of battle. He pointed to a map sprawled across the table, his fingers tracing the advancing enemy troops. They will be upon us within a fortnight. If we do not act now, they will reach the capital before winter's end. Henry swallowed hard. He barely understood the layout of the palace, let alone the intricate details of warfare. Just days ago, he had been plowing fields, not preparing for an invasion. He glanced across the table, searching for support, but found none. The nobles whispered among themselves, their faces unreadable, their contempt thinly veiled. And then there was Princess Evelyn, sitting opposite of him, her arms crossed, and her emerald eyes locked onto him like a hawk assessing its prey. "You expect him to lead an army?" one of the nobles scoffed, looking Henry up and down as if he were a child playing a kingship. He could barely carry himself in court, let alone a battlefield. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Henry felt the heat of their scrutiny, but forced himself to sit taller. He had not asked for this role, but if Valmoria was to survive, he had to at least try. "I may not know war," Henry admitted, his voice steady despite his nerves, "but I know my people. If we surrender, Tremor will show no mercy. If we flee, Valmoria will fall. But if we stand our ground, together, we have a chance." A heavy silence followed. Evelyn narrowed her eyes. She had expected him to crumble under pressure, to look to the crowd for guidance, to beg for their wisdom. Instead, he stood firm. It was unexpected, though she refused to show it. "You speak of unity," she said coldly, "but unity without strategy is nothing more than foolish bravery. If we are to fight, then we need more than just words. We need leadership." Henry met her gaze. "Then teach me," he said, surprising even himself. "You know this court better than I do. You know its politics, its strategies. If I am to rule, then let me learn." Evelyn hesitated. She despised the idea of training him, of molding him into something he was never meant to be. But if Valmoria was to have any chance of survival, she had no choice. So began Henry's rigorous training. Days were spent learning military formations, understanding the kingdom's alliances, and grasping the delicate art of diplomacy. Nights were filled with lessons on court etiquette, the weight of each word he spoke scrutinized by the nobles who still doubted him. He fumbled, stumbled, and made mistakes, but he listened, he learned, and slowly he began to find his footing. His sincerity earned him allies in unexpected places. The palace guards, once wary, started to respect his determination. A few knights, particularly the young and ambitious, began to rally behind him. Even among the common folk, whispers spread of a king who, despite his humble origins, was trying to do right by them. But war did not wait for a king to be ready. On the 10th night of his rule, a scout burst into the war room, breathless and covered in dust. "Tremor's forces have reached the outer villages," he panted. They set fire to the fields. The people were fleeing. Panic filled the chamber, but Henry forced himself to stay calm. He turned to Evelyn, who watched him carefully, waiting to see what he would do. The nobles wished to retreat to the capital and prepare for a siege, General Alric informed him. "They believe we cannot match Tremor's forces in open battle." Henry shook his head. "If we hide behind these walls, Tremor will cut off our resources, starve us out, and burn everything we have left. We cannot afford to wait." The room fell silent. Henry had spoken with certainty. Evelyn studied him, seeing for the first time not a farm boy, but a ruler willing to risk everything for his kingdom. She still doubted his ability, but she could no longer deny his resolve. "If you mean to fight," she said, "then you had better to be prepared to win." Henry nodded. War had come to Valmoria, and whether he was ready or not, the time for proving himself was over. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier. Henry stood atop the castle ramparts, staring at the horizon, where the fires of Tremor's invasion burned in the distance. The scent of smoldering fields carried on the wind, a cruel reminder of how much had already been lost. He had been king for mere weeks, yet Valmoria teetered on the brink of ruin. The nobility doubted him, the army hesitated under his command, and the enemy was at their doorstep. He had to act. The war council had convened again that morning, their voices raised in frantic debate over how to defend the kingdom. The older nobles argued for a retreat to the capital, fortifying the walls and waiting out a siege. The generals called for a head-on battle, though Valmoria's forces were outnumbered nearly 3-1. Both options led to disaster. Henry saw another way. "We will not fight them on their terms," Henry declared, stepping forward. "We will fight them on ours." The council quieted. Even General Alaric, who had been skeptical of the young king, narrowed his gaze with interest. "The fields they burned belong to our people," Henry continued, his voice steady. "The forests they marched through have sheltered our ancestors for centuries. We know this land better than they ever could. Instead of facing them head-on, we will turn Valmoria itself into our greatest weapon." Princess Evelyn, arms crossed as she listened, arched an eyebrow. "And how do you intend to do that?" Henry met her gaze. "By turning the people into our army." Silence followed, and scoffs of disbelief from some of the nobles. "You expect farmers and blacksmiths to defeat trained soldiers?" One sneered. "I expect them to fight for their home," Henry shot back. "A soldier fights because he is ordered to. A man defending his family fights with the strength of 10. Evelyn frowned, but said nothing. Thus, Henry's plan began to take shape. While the standing army prepared for engagement, Henry personally traveled from village to village, calling upon the people to stand and fight. He rode alongside the knights, his presence unexpected among the common folk. He did not give grand speeches. He did not make hollow promises. Instead, he listened. When a blacksmith named Rogan worried his sons would die in battle, Henry lifted a hammer and helped him forge weapons. When a widow feared for her farm, Henry worked alongside her, repairing what had been damaged. When a young boy asked if the king was afraid, Henry knelt before him and answered truthfully, "Yes, but fear only means you have something worth fighting for." Slowly, the people rallied. Farmers fashioned makeshift spears from broken tools. Hunters turned their bows against the invaders. The elderly reinforced barricades while the young carried messages between units. Henry led not from behind castle walls, but among them, shoulder to shoulder. As the days passed, even the skeptical nobles had to admit the people were fighting for their king. Evelyn observed from a distance, torn between frustration and admiration. She had always believed leadership was about command, about proving one's worth through strength and bloodline. But Henry was proving something else entirely. He did not command the people's loyalty, he earned it. When the battle finally came, it was not the clash of two great armies, but a war fought in the forests, the rivers, and the fields of Valmoria. Draymor's forces found themselves lost in unfamiliar terrain, harassed by ambushes and traps set by the very people they sought to conquer. What should have been an overwhelming victory became a slow, grinding struggle. On the battlefield, Henry fought despite his lack of training. He was no master swordsman, but he fought alongside his people, covered in the same dirt and sweat as those who had once dismissed him as a mere farmhand. The moment that changed everything came in the heated battle. The Draymore captain charged at Henry, blade raised. For a fleeting second, Henry saw his death. But then steel flashed and the enemy fell, cut down by the blacksmith he had helped. For the first time, she understood. It wasn't bloodline that made him a ruler. It was a willingness to fight when no one else would. By nightfall, Draymor's forces and army, battered and demoralized, began to retreat. Valmoria had held, and for the first time when the people looked at Henry, they did not see a farm boy. They saw their king. The battlefield still smoldered. Valmoria had emerged victorious, but at a terrible cost. The bodies of the fallen, soldiers, farmers, blacksmiths, and hunters alike, littered the land they had fought so desperately to protect. The scent of blood and ash clung to the wind as the survivors gathered in the castle square, battered but alive. Henry stood before them, not as a farm boy thrust into kingship, but as their ruler. He no longer fumbled with his words, no longer doubted himself. He met their eyes with strength. "You fought for your homes, for your families, for each other," Henry said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Not because a king commanded it, but because this land is yours, and as long as Valmoria stands, no tyrant will take it from you." A deafening roar of approval rose from the people. They did not see him as a boy playing at kingship. They saw the leader they had chosen. Henry felt it then. The weight of the crown no longer burdened him. It belonged to him. Yet his moment of triumph was short-lived. That evening, as the city celebrated and fires burned in tribute to the fallen, a messenger arrived at Henry's chamber. The ancient elder, Master Gallen, had summoned him. Henry made his way through the dimly lit corridors, the echoes of distant revelry fading as he entered the elder's chamber. Callan sat in the ornate wooden chair, a fire crackling behind him, his aged eyes unreadable. "Sit, your majesty," Callan said, though his tone held no reverence, only gravity. Henry lowered himself into the chair across from the elder. "What is this about?" Callan exhaled slowly. "It is time you learned the truth," he said. "You were never meant to be king." The words struck like a blade to the gut. Henry felt the air leave his lungs. "What?" "The prophecy," Callan continued, his fingers folding together. "It was misinterpreted, twisted by those who wished to manipulate fate." Henry shook his head. "It's not possible. The council declared me the chosen one." Callan nodded solemnly. "Because they wanted to believe it. The kingdom needed hope, a king born of the people. It was an easy tale to spread, a powerful symbol in a time of crisis. But the prophecy never named you. It never named anyone." Henry's hands clenched as the arms of the chair. His mind spun. If what Callan said was true, then everything, his rule, his fight, his victory, had been built on a lie. "Then I was never special," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Callan studied him for a long moment before a small, knowing smile touched his lips. "No," he said, "you weren't." The elder leaned forward, his eyes burning with wisdom. "And that is why you were king. Not because of fate, not because of some divine destiny. Because when the kingdom needed a leader, you chose to become one." Henry swallowed, his mind racing. He had spent his life believing that greatness was something bestowed, something one was born into. Yet he had fought for Valmoria not because he had been told to, because he had wanted to. "You were never meant to rule," Callan said. "Yet you became the ruler Valmoria needed. That is greater than any prophecy." The words settled deep in Henry's heart, displacing the doubt that had begun to creep in. As he stood to leave, his thoughts whirling, he found himself face to face with Evelyn. She had been listening. For once there was no scorn in her expression, no bitterness, just quiet understanding. "So," she said, crossing her arms, "you were never meant to be king." Henry met her gaze. "No." A long silence stretched between them before she finally spoke. "And yet, you are." He nodded. Evelyn studied him for a long moment before shaking her head with something that almost resembled admiration. "Perhaps," she murmured, "that makes you more deserving of the throne than anyone." She turned and walked away, leaving Henry with the realization that for the first time, she truly saw him, not as a farm boy who got lucky, but as the king Valmoria chose to follow. Henry stood atop the castle's highest balcony, looking out over the kingdom of Valmoria. The city below was alive with celebration. Torches flickered among the streets, banners swayed in the wind, and the sounds of music and laughter filled the night air. The people chanted his name, their voices rising in unison, calling for the ruler they had chosen. Not because of prophecy, not because of bloodline, but because of who he had become. Yet deep within, doubt still lingered. Callan's revelation weighed on his mind. He had spent so long believing he had been meant for this, that fate had pulled him from the fields of Eldamir and thrust him into greatness. But now he knew the truth. There was never a prophecy, no divine hand that guided him here. It had all been a lie. So what did that mean for him now? As the cheers continued outside, he turned from the balcony, his hands tightening into fists. The throne was his, but should it be? The sound of the doors opening pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Evelyn standing there, dressed not in a gown of royal finery, but in the simple tunic and trousers she wore when training with the knights. A sign, perhaps, that she was shedding the pretense between them. "You haven't joined the celebration," she observed. Henry exhaled slowly. "There's something I need to decide first." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, stepping closer. "Whether you should step down?" He nodded. "I was never meant to be king. The prophecy was a lie. If I stay on the throne, am I any better than the nobles who manipulate power for their own gain?" Evelyn studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Do you truly believe that the throne belongs to anyone else?" Henry hesitated. He expected her to mock him, to remind him once again that he was nothing more than a farm boy. But the fire of skepticism that had once burned in her eyes was gone. What remained was something else. Understanding. "You weren't born into royalty," she continued. "You didn't train for this your entire life. You weren't meant to be king, and yet..." She gestured toward the city, where the people still chanted his name. "They follow you, not because of some prophecy, but because you earned it." Henry looked down at his hands that had once known nothing but soil and toil. Now they bore the scars of war, the weight of leadership. I was wrong about you, Evelyn admitted, stepping closer. When you arrived, I thought you were a mistake. I thought Valmoria deserved better, but I see now you were exactly the king this kingdom needed. Not because fate chose you, but because you chose to be. Her words settled deep within him. The doubt, the fear, and uncertainty, it all began to fade. He had spent so much time wondering if he was meant for this throne, when the truth was far simpler. He had fought for it. He had bled for it. He had become it. Henry turned back toward the balcony, looking out over his people. This was his kingdom, not because of some divine decree, but because the people chose him. And so, he made his decision. He would stay. The following days were filled with renewed purpose. Henry ruled not with arrogance, but with humility. He continued to learn, to grow, to shape Valmoria into something greater. He listened to the people, not as a king who ruled from above, but as a leader who walked among them. And in time, the bond between him and Evelyn deepened. She had once seen him as an unworthy usurper. Now she saw him as a man who had proven himself in ways no noble ever could. He had her respect, not because of birthright, but because he had earned it. When the council proposed an official betrothal between them, many expected it to be a political formality. But when Henry took Evelyn's hand in his, the look they shared spoke of something far more than duty. It was admiration. It was respect. And in time, it would be love. Henry's story was not one of destiny. It was not one of fate. It was a story of choice. And that, more than the prophecy and anything else, was what truly made him a king.